At exactly 3 p.m. local time, the Caribbean looked almost deceptively peaceful. The water was calm and level beneath the bright afternoon sun, the trade winds were steady, and visibility stretched for miles. For most ships passing through those waters, it would have felt like just another uneventful day at sea. But for the sailors standing watch, that sense of calm was already beginning to feel misleading. On the radar displays, a pattern slowly started to take shape. At first, the surface contacts appeared ordinary, the kind of distant returns that rarely attract special attention. Then the picture began to change in ways experienced crews never dismiss. Courses shifted, speeds increased. Bearings started to draw together, not by chance, but with clear purpose. One after another, several Venezuelan surface vessels adjusted their headings and moved toward the projected track of an American carrier strike group that was lawfully transiting through international waters. No one on the bridge needed to raise their voice. There was no panic, no confusion, only calm confirmation. The contacts were maneuvering with intent. A carrier strike group never moves through open water blindly. Every mile around it is monitored, measured, and documented. Radar operators tracked each speed change down to the knot. Combat systems teams recalculated the closest points of approach in real time. What the Venezuelan ships were doing was subtle enough to look ambiguous to an untrained observer, yet to professionals, it was unmistakable. They were moving into position to obstruct. And obstructing the path of a carrier strike group is not something that happens by accident. At those distances, every small decision matters. A minor turn can be explained away as routine navigation. A sustained intercept course cannot. As the minutes passed, the situation grew clearer. The Venezuelan ships were no longer merely shadowing. They were pressing the boundary, testing how close they could come, how much pressure they could apply, and how the U.S. Navy would choose to answer. The American formation, however, remained steady. The carrier held its course. The escort ship stayed exactly where they needed to be, layered around it like a moving shield. There were no abrupt turns, no dramatic changes in speed. The response was quiet, controlled, and unmistakably confident. "We see you." Inside the Combat Information Center, the posture shifted from routine observation to full documentation. Every radar emission from the approaching ships was recorded. Every maneuver was time-stamped. Optical systems locked on and delivered high-resolution imagery to analysts who did not need assumptions, only verifiable facts. This was not about reacting quickly for the sake of appearance. It was about reacting correctly. Encounters like this are rarely about immediate conflict. More often, they are about pressure, symbolism, and the possibility of shaping a narrative afterward. Force the carrier to alter course. Force a visible response. Create a moment that can later be framed as defiance, resistance, or a political win. But a carrier strike group is not a lone vessel that can simply be pushed aside. It is a coordinated system built to absorb pressure without losing its structure. And the closer the Venezuelan ships moved, the more they revealed. Their doctrine, their coordination, their confidence level, and just as importantly, their limitations all became easier to read. The irony was hard to miss. The more pressure they tried to apply, the calmer the American response became. There were no dramatic broadcasts over open channels, no theatrical warnings, no unnecessary displays. Standard bridge-to-bridge calls were transmitted, professional and precise, identifying position, course, and the lawful status of the transit. No reply came back. That silence said enough on its own. By then, every sailor involved understood how significant the moment was. Not because anything explosive was about to happen, but because these are exactly the situations where history can turn on a misjudgment. One bad calculation, one unnecessary reaction, one moment of overreach. That is how routine patrols turn into incidents remembered for years. So the carrier strike group did exactly what it had been trained to do. It kept moving. The sea stayed calm. The sky remained clear. Yet beneath that calm surface, the situation had already crossed an invisible line, not through open confrontation, but through deliberate intent. Venezuela had chosen to step directly into the path of one of the most disciplined naval formations in the world. From that point forward, everything was being captured, measured, and remembered. By 3:12 p.m., the pattern was no longer open to interpretation. The Venezuelan ships had moved close enough that their intentions could be measured rather than guessed. Their speed changes were consistent. Their headings were deliberate. Instead of holding parallel tracks or maintaining broad shadowing arcs, they angled inward, cutting across projected routes, narrowing the distance, and creating geometry that left very little room for coincidence. This was no longer routine presence. On American displays, the closest point of approach continued to shrink. First 5 nautical miles, then 4. Each update came with a fresh time-to-intercept calculation. The numbers were straightforward. If the geometry held, the Venezuelan formation would cross directly ahead of the carrier strike group within minutes. Still, the American ships did not change course. In naval operations, maintaining course can be one of the strongest signals possible. It communicates confidence, it removes ambiguity. Most of all, it denies the other side the visible reaction they may be hoping to provoke. The Venezuelan vessels continued forward. Radio silence remained in place. There was no bridge-to-bridge coordination, no attempt to clarify intent, no effort to reduce uncertainty. To experienced watch officers, that absence mattered. Professional ships do not usually remain silent when distance is closing quickly. Silence at close range is not a detail, it is a decision. From the Venezuelan side, the logic was understandable. On paper, they had no realistic ability to overpower a carrier strike group, and that was likely never the point. The goal was friction. To make the Americans alter course, to capture images that could later be presented as resistance, to show domestic audiences a navy standing up to a much larger power. But the ocean has little patience for theater. It rewards discipline. As the gap narrowed, American escort ships made subtle adjustments to their internal spacing. Not outwardly aggressive, but exact and purposeful. Sensors shifted priority. Surface search radar refined its focus. Electro-optical systems began tracking hull numbers, activity on deck, and crew movement. Everything the Venezuelan crews did above the waterline was now visible, enlarged, and archived. Inside the Combat Information Center, every movement was logged. The atmosphere remained composed. No rushed commands, no visible stress. Only a steady stream of data, bearings, speeds, and emissions. Each Venezuelan ship had stopped being just a radar contact. It had become a profile, and profiles tell stories. Those profiles showed small signs of hesitation in formation keeping, slight speed mismatches, and minor course corrections that hinted at uncertainty more than confidence. This did not look like a polished maneuver by a navy accustomed to operating around near-peer forces. It looked more like carefully applied pressure, measured enough to appear bold, but cautious enough to avoid losing control of the encounter. The carrier strike group did not change its response. Standard maritime warnings continued, calm and legally precise. International waters, lawful transit, maintain safe separation. The messages were professional, clear, and recorded. Again, no reply came. At 3:21 p.m., one Venezuelan ship surged slightly ahead of the others, briefly increasing speed beyond the rest of the formation. It was a probing move, a test to see whether the Americans would finally react, whether the carrier would turn, or whether the escorts would visibly shift. They did not. That was the quiet moment when the balance began to change. Pressure only works when it creates a reaction. With every passing minute, the Venezuelan ships were using fuel, revealing operating limits, broadcasting emissions, and committing themselves more deeply to an encounter they did not fully control. The Americans, meanwhile, were gathering information while revealing almost nothing in return. That is one of the defining asymmetries of modern naval power. You do not need to fire a shot to come out ahead in an encounter. Sometimes all you need is the discipline to remain composed long enough for the other side to expose itself. By 3:28 p.m., the geometry finally stopped tightening. The Venezuelan ships held position just short of the intercept line, close enough to claim presence, but not close enough to risk collision or force a truly dangerous escalation. It was a pause, but it was not a success. By that stage, the attempt to block had already failed. The carrier strike group had not changed course. It had not slowed. It had not treated the provocation as anything beyond a matter for standard procedure. In doing so, it denied Venezuela the one thing the entire maneuver seemed designed to create: leverage. What remained was an uneasy standoff. One side calm, steady, and silent. The other committed, but increasingly unsure of what came next. And in encounters like these, uncertainty is where danger grows. Once pressure stops producing results, only two paths remain: intensify the situation or pull away. Venezuela was running out of room for either option. By 3:30 p.m., the encounter entered its most delicate phase. Not because anything dramatic was happening on the surface, but because intent was now impossible to misread. This is where less disciplined forces sometimes make costly mistakes. The U.S. Navy did not. Across the carrier strike group, posture shifted internally. Not dramatically, not in ways obvious to an outside observer, but in the systems that mattered. Combat systems moved from general monitoring to active prioritization. Sensor tasking became tighter. Data feeds were cross-checked and synchronized down to the second. What looked calm above deck was, below the surface, a highly coordinated machine doing exactly what it had been built to do. Watch everything, record everything, and reveal nothing it did not need to reveal. The carrier continued on course and at speed. Escorts kept their formation with spacing that remained deliberate and unchanged. There was no sudden move that could be interpreted as intimidation, and no visible escalation that could be misunderstood. The message was restraint, but restraint backed by complete awareness. That difference matters. Restraint without capability can look like weakness. Restraint backed by capability is control. As the Venezuelan ships lingered near the intercept geometry, American sensors quietly took over the encounter in the most important way. Surface search radar increased resolution. Electro-optical systems focused on bridge wings, mast arrays, and activity across the decks. Electronic warfare teams logged emissions, frequency, power, and duration. Each radar sweep from the Venezuelan vessels added another layer to a growing intelligence picture. In modern naval operations, information is a form of leverage. The U.S. Navy was collecting it in volume. At 3:34 p.m., an American helicopter lifted off from the deck of one of the escort ships. The launch was smooth, deliberate, and unmistakably professional. There were no aggressive low passes, no dramatic banking turns, no unnecessary showmanship. It climbed in a controlled arc and moved toward the contact area with measured precision. From the Venezuelan perspective, the signal was obvious. The situation was now being observed not only from the surface, but from above. The helicopter maintained a safe altitude and distance, its presence steady and non-provocative, yet impossible to ignore. Its sensors, however, were doing serious work. Infrared systems monitored engine heat and wake patterns. High-definition optics captured movement on deck in real time. Every action, every posture, every adjustment was now part of a larger record. And that was the deeper reality of the encounter. What may have begun as an attempt to create pressure had turned into something else entirely. The Venezuelan ships were no longer shaping the moment. They were being studied by a force that had no need to rush, no need to overreact, and no need to prove anything through spectacle. The carrier strike group had answered the challenge in the most effective way possible, with discipline, precision, and absolute control of the situation. Every frame was geo-referenced and time-stamped. This was not a display meant to intimidate. It was a methodical collection of evidence. Standard warnings were transmitted once again, measured, precise, and fully recorded. International waters, unsafe maneuvering, maintain distance. The wording stayed consistent throughout. Calm, professional, and final. The Venezuelan ships answered without speaking. Their response showed up in hesitation. Speeds shifted slightly. Course lines softened by a few degrees. Activity on deck lost some of its urgency. On paper, those may seem like minor details, but in close naval encounters, the smallest changes often reveal the most. Confidence stays steady, uncertainty begins to flicker. And through it all, the American formation remained exactly as it had been. No one raised their voice. No one rushed the moment. Because the U.S. Navy does not operate on emotion. It operates on doctrine. And doctrine teaches a simple truth. The longer you remain steady and predictable, the more pressure moves onto the other side. By this stage, the Venezuelan crews were facing an uncomfortable reality. They had committed enough to the maneuver that pulling away too soon would look like backing down. But moving any closer risked crossing a line with consequences they could neither predict nor control. That is the hidden trap of brinkmanship at sea. You move forward to create effect. You pause, expecting a reaction. And when that reaction never comes, you are the one left exposed. Fuel burning, sensors transmitting, crews tense, commanders waiting for a decisive moment that never arrives. Inside the American combat information centers, there was no debate and no need for speculation. Everything important was already being captured in real time. The encounter was no longer about which ship had tried to block which. It was about who still controlled freedom of action. And by then, that answer was becoming obvious. At 3:42 p.m., the Venezuelan lead ship began to ease back with a gradual reduction in speed. There was no announcement and no acknowledgement, only a subtle step away from the line it had been pushing toward moments earlier. The helicopter kept its orbit. The escorts held their positions. The carrier continued forward without interruption. There were no victory speeches, no triumphant radio calls, only professionalism continuing to do exactly what it was meant to do. That is what makes the most decisive moments at sea so easy for outsiders to miss. They rarely look dramatic. They look controlled, measured, almost uneventful to an untrained eye. But every sailor involved understood what had happened. The attempt to obstruct had failed, not because it had been directly challenged, but because it had been denied significance. And in the logic of modern naval power, that can be the most decisive response of all. By 3:45 p.m., the outcome was no longer difficult to read. The Venezuelan maneuver had reached its limit, not because the U.S. Navy forced it to stop, but because it had stopped producing any result. That was where the error became unmistakable. A blocking move only works if the other side reacts. The entire idea depended on pressure-creating movement, a turn, a slowdown, some visible adjustment that could later be presented as success. But the carrier strike group never gave them that moment. No course change, no hesitation, no escalation. And by refusing to react, the U.S. Navy turned the entire encounter upside down. From that point on, every extra minute favored the Americans. Fuel consumption kept rising aboard the Venezuelan ships. Formation discipline started to loosen, small inconsistencies appeared, one vessel lagged, another edged too far ahead. These were not dramatic mistakes, but they were meaningful. They exposed the limits of coordination and endurance under sustained pressure. More importantly, the Venezuelan ships had already crossed the most dangerous threshold of all. They had revealed themselves. Every radar sweep, every engine surge, every movement on deck had been captured, cataloged, and archived. What had started as an attempt to create a political image had become a live demonstration of Venezuelan naval behavior under tension. And information like that does not simply vanish. It is reviewed, compared, filed beside earlier encounters, and used to sharpen future assessments about how a force maneuvers, where it hesitates, and how it chooses to disengage. That is where the strategic miscalculation became impossible to ignore. Venezuela likely never intended a direct fight, but by stepping so close, it allowed itself to be measured by a force designed not only to deter, but to observe, analyze, and learn. The longer those ships stayed near the strike group, the more they gave away without getting anything back in return. The carrier strike group, meanwhile, lost nothing. Its formation stayed intact. Its mission continued without interruption. Its crews remained within doctrine from start to finish, creating no dramatic footage that could be exaggerated and no reaction that could be reframed later for effect. From both a legal and operational perspective, the Americans were exactly where they were allowed to be, doing exactly what international law permitted. And that imbalance is what makes brinkmanship so dangerous for the weaker side. When one force is acting and the other is simply documenting, the side taking action loses leverage first. At 3:51 p.m., the Venezuelan ships began to drift outward. Not sharply, not in obvious retreat, but enough to break the blocking geometry they had tried to create. Speeds returned to normal, courses widened. The intercept line dissolved quietly, almost awkwardly. There was no formal statement of disengagement and no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened, but everyone involved understood the meaning. The maneuver had failed, not through confrontation, not through warning shots, but through silence. That is the paradox of modern naval power. Often the strongest response is the one that looks the least dramatic. It does not shout, it does not threaten. It simply narrows the other side's options until only one remains. In this case, that remaining option was disengagement. The Venezuelan crews were left with footage of ships approaching, lingering, and then gradually easing away. There was no American turn, no forced reaction, no clear moment of triumph. Whatever message had been intended for audiences back home no longer had the ending it needed. The U.S. Navy, on the other hand, came away with something far more valuable than a headline. It came away with clarity. Clarity about Venezuelan tactics, clarity about command confidence, clarity about how pressure was applied and how quickly it weakened when it was not backed by real capability. That was the true cost of the encounter. Because the next confrontation, if one ever comes, will not begin from zero. It will begin with what was learned here. And every move Venezuela made during this attempted block will remain on record, not as a display of strength, but as a study in overreach. By the time the Caribbean settled back into stillness, the carrier strike group was already miles beyond the point of contact, steady on course and fully on mission. The Venezuelan ships were left behind, more scattered, more silent, and with little to show for the risk they had taken. That is why the maneuver was a mistake. Not simply because Venezuela chose to challenge a carrier strike group, but because it chose to do so without fully understanding what happens when pressure is applied to a force that does not need to react in order to come out ahead. By 4 p.m., the encounter was effectively over. The Venezuelan vessels had fallen back far enough that the geometry no longer mattered. Distances widened, bearings stabilized. What remained on American radar displays was no longer a challenge, only background traffic fading into the normal flow of the Caribbean Sea. The carrier strike group never slowed. From the flight deck and across the carrier, nothing outwardly seemed unusual. Aircraft operations continued on schedule. Watch teams rotated as planned. The ship's massive hull moved steadily through calm water, almost indifferent to what had unfolded behind it. That, in many ways, was the point. For the U.S. Navy, success was never about spectacle. It was about continuity. The mission had not been interrupted. No deviation had been required. No emergency posture had been declared. The strike group moved on exactly as planned, leaving behind an encounter that might seem quiet from a distance, but carried clear meaning for those who understood what they were watching. Because the real aftermath did not happen on the sea surface, it happened in the data. Every sensor log, every radar return, every optical frame captured during the attempted block was already being compiled, cross-checked, and analyzed. Not emotionally, not politically, professionally. Patterns were identified. Maneuvering behavior was mapped. Response timelines were measured down to the second. This is how modern naval power builds on itself, not through spectacle, but through accumulation. Encounter by encounter, detail by detail, advantage grows. For Venezuela, the immediate outcome was uncomfortable. There was no footage of an American withdrawal, no dramatic standoff to broadcast, no clean narrative that could easily be presented as victory. What remained instead was silence, an incomplete ending that made the entire maneuver difficult to explain. And in situations like this, silence is rarely neutral. It raises questions. It invites scrutiny. It exposes intent without delivering payoff. For the U.S. Navy, the result was much simpler. Another transit completed, another encounter documented, another quiet demonstration that restraint, when paired with overwhelming capability, is not passivity. It is control exercised with confidence. That difference matters well beyond the Caribbean. Naval encounters are never truly isolated. They become reference points. Each one shapes expectations for the next. Every action or refusal to act creates a precedent that future commanders, governments, and crews will remember. What Venezuela attempted that afternoon was not unique in principle. Smaller navies have long used proximity and pressure to test larger forces. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it triggers an overreaction. Sometimes it creates exactly the image it was intended to create. But this time, it did none of those things. Instead, it revealed a deeper misunderstanding. Power is not measured by how loudly a force answers a challenge. Power is measured by how little it needs to do. The carrier strike group did not turn. It did not threaten. It did not intensify the situation. And by refusing to provide the reaction Venezuela needed, it left the other side with only one realistic option that avoided greater risk: easing away quietly without acknowledgement. That result sends a far more lasting message than any public broadcast ever could. It tells future challengers that pressure without leverage falls apart quickly. That proximity without capability ends up benefiting the side prepared to remain patient. And that in encounters like this, the most dangerous moment is not when weapons are prepared, but when one side realizes the other never needed to prepare them at all. As the sun continued its slow descent across the Caribbean, the sea returned to the same calm appearance it had worn from the beginning. To a distant observer, it might have looked as though nothing had happened. But for the sailors tracking the geometry, the analysts studying the logs, and the commanders weighing the implications, the lesson was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy did not come out ahead through force alone. It did so through discipline, restraint, and complete control of the moment. And for Venezuela, that is the kind of outcome that is hardest to explain, because it leaves no dramatic ending, only a quiet record of who stayed steady, who lost leverage, and who ultimately had no choice but to fall away.